That's the way I remember it.
Yes,
I will
yes.
never do
That's
it again.
hard
No,
because I
she
have
had
no
a
place.
conflict and checked and made sure. Okay,
To be in this room.
maybe I'll stand up. Okay, thanks for your patience. We're going to get started. My name is Gary Wilder. I'm the director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. And this is the opening session of our spring symposium, Practicing Translation, Translating Politics. And I think there's no better way to start things off than with a discussion of, I learned this from Herman, gotta show the book. From Suleiman Bashir Jan's new book, which should have been translated, How to Philosophize in Islam, but maybe we can talk about the translated title, Open to Reason. Oh my God, sorry. So Suleiman Bashir Jan is a professor in the departments of philosophy, French, and Romance philology at Columbia University. His fields of research includes Boolean algebra of logic, history of philosophy, Islamic philosophy, African philosophy, and literature. Those who know him know that he crosses many, many different boundaries. He's the author of a book on Boole, a book called Islam and the Open Society, a book on African art as philosophy, Senghor, Bergson, and the idea of negritude. The book before this was called The Ink of Scholars, Reflections on Philosophy in Africa, and this book is called Open to Reason. His book, his French book on Bergson Postcolonial is also about to be translated into English. So briefly, one of the best things about the Committee on Globalization and Social Change is ongoing dialogue with a core group of people over a sustained period of time. This has also enabled us to form a network of interlocutors, and I'm proud to say that Bashir is one of our most valued interlocutors. He's presented here multiple times. We've read his work in our faculty seminar. This book aligns beautifully in all kinds of ways with our thinking about translation this year. One of the many things I admire about Bashir is that he really practices what he preaches. His writings convey a remarkable spirit of openness, generosity, and modesty. His work is non-dogmatic and dialogical. But we should not be misled by his characteristic modesty. This new book, like his others, purports to be introductory and descriptive. And like his last book on African philosophy, it is short, clear, and synthetic. But under the guise of an overview of other philosophers, he once again develops a very powerful philosophical argument in his own right that quietly intervenes into numerous debates in ways that displace all manner of conventional assumptions and interpretations. By calling into question supposedly settled boundaries between the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, Islam and the West, religion and philosophy, faith and reason, we could go on. His supposedly introductory account has far-reaching epistemological, ethical, and political implications. Certainly thinking across these boundaries should be understood as something like a translational practice, must at least be understood in relation to translation as a problem. So here to initiate our discussion are two more deep thinkers whom I admire very much, who I think are beautifully situated to engage with Bashir's work. So let me briefly introduce them, and then we will continue on to the conversation. To my left is R.A. Judy, who is professor of critical and cultural studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh and a member of the Boundary 2 editorial collective. After studying at Al-Azhar University, he received a BA in Islamic philosophy and culture from the University of Minnesota and completed a PhD in comparative literature. He is the author of the book Disforming the American Canon, the Vernacular of African, Arabic, American Slave Narrative. And he's also edited a number of important volumes for Boundary 2, including the Tunisia dossier in 2012, and Sociology Hesitant, W.E.B. Du Bois's Dynamic Thinking. And his latest book, Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poesis in Black, is currently at Duke University Press and projected to be published in spring 2020. So that's R.A. And to his left is our friend and colleague and core member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, Susan Buck-Moores, who's also, incidentally, a professor of political science at the Graduate Center. She's written many books that we are familiar with: The Origins of Negative Dialectics, Dialectics of Seeing, Dream World and Catastrophe, Thinking Past Terror, and Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, but is on the brink of finishing year one, which will be published by MIT Press in summer of 2020, and has completed Revolutionary Today, which will...
Revolution Today.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Revolution Today.
I gotcha. Revolution Today. I can't read my own writing. Revolutionary... God. Revolution Today. Stop. Which will be out with Haymarket Press in May, very soon, next month. So welcome, Bashir, and we're going to start with RA. They'll offer some comments, Bashir will respond, and then we'll just open it up to a discussion.
Speaking of Revolution Today, I think we had decided we would start with Susan.
Oh, okay.
If we may be permitted to rebel.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much, all of you, and thank you, Bashir, for coming. It's just a pleasure to read Bashir's work. All of those of you who are lucky enough to have read anything know that that's the case. It's deceptively simple, and I'm going to say something about the language at the very end, because this language is extremely crafted, it's extremely careful, and it says a lot. Translation is not just something that happens with Bashir, it's the center of what he does. He's been known to say things like, if you speak only one language, you should not philosophize. Something like, don't enter here, right? If you do not speak more than one language, of course, he's totally at home in English and French and Arabic and probably multiple African languages, West African languages, and there are probably others I don't know about. But this is someone whose life, whose thought is impossible to imagine without translation, and that gives him such an advantage over anyone who thinks that language actually speaks only one way. So this is our year on translation, so there's no way we couldn't have Bashir start us off for the conference that's coming up today and all day tomorrow. And I just want to say 2 or 3 things that I get out of this new book. The book that came out not so long ago, The Ink of Scholars, is also in my head. I mean, they're coming out rather quickly, and there's more in the works. But I'm going to try to keep my comments brief. I'm only allowed, I think, 15 minutes, and Gary, you will put your hand up and make faces. Good. Okay, so let me just say what, to me, are some takeaways here that I think are terribly, terribly important. Islam as a philosophy is difficult for Westerners to get into because we have all kinds of prejudices, particularly modern Westerners, against the certain fundamental moves. And so there's a prejudice that's built in, I would say, to Western philosophy against understanding this. And my own work recently in the first century has enlightened me to some degree on this, just through struggling through some of these pre-modern texts and becoming more and more convinced that modernity, post-modernity, apocalypse is just not the trajectory of the future. There are a whole mess of other things that are opening up, and one of them is a reconsideration of transcendence. And this I find so important in Bashir's work. What do I mean by transcendence? It's very clear in this, the argument that Bashir makes that philosophizing is required of Islam, that anytime you have transcendence, you obviously are going to have an unknown that no one human being is going to be able to comprehend. And what follows from that are many things. One is, as I think you say at one point, and I'm not looking at my text, so my paraphrases may not be great. One thing that you remind us is that only God can understand the Quran. So anything that we say as an interpretation is partial, is tentative, is changing, and needs others, right? And that means that pluralism is not just a kind of multiculturalism, nothing of that sort, but it is fundamental to what it is to philosophize. And that opens up a kind of generosity that is the hallmark, actually, of your thinking, at least as I know you. So there are lots of ways that this resonates with other religions. I don't like the word religions, but other apophatic thought, perhaps you could say, other thought that doesn't think that it's all immanent, that allows it to escape this phony notion that permeates modernity, that as long as we stay immanent, we have nothing to fear. I mean, what we do have to fear is some mere mortal saying, I know the transcendent, and you have to follow what I say it is. And you take the hardest case, Al-Ghazali, to make your point. I say he's the hardest case because, you know, someone like Theodor Adorno does not mention many Islamic thinkers, but he has a one-liner on Al-Ghazali, which is very typical of Western prejudice, and it is that this is a man who threw reason out and adhered to a kind of orthodoxy and lack of thought, which then locks Islam into the Dark Ages. And of course, that thematics is also citations that you give from Muslim thinkers as well. This is an ease this kind of approach. But what you so beautifully show us is that this is a man who first comprehends Aristotle and the Western tradition that came to him through the translation movement under the Caliph al-Ma'mun, and then criticizes it, and then realizes that he still isn't happy, and he becomes a Sufi, and he takes all these different positions. And ultimately, what he comes down to is the importance of the good of the community. And the argument is a kind of an anti-elitist argument, which at times, and you point this out, at times of great struggle and uncertainty, politically, let's say, or in every other way, this was a very dangerous time to do anything but try to knit the community together. And what that reminded me of is the work that comes out of working on someone like Josephus on the Jewish war, stasis, the importance of stasis as a problematic. The word in Greek, I don't know what happens in Arabic, but in Greek it's really, really quite fascinating, because on the one hand, Solon says in ancient Greece, you have to take a stand. Stasis is to take a stand. That means you have to participate in the public debate. But stasis means not only to take a stand, it also means civil war. So when things get too far, then the problematic is violence, and the good of the community is thereby sacrificed. So this is one reason why the truth changes in time, why the truth is specific to a certain, not in the sense that of a relativism, like historical relativism, but it's specific to a situation. Something that is spoken is also the historical reality in the text. It comes in the text. And if you don't pay attention to that, you're going to misunderstand what it says. I'm going now to move very quickly and without much of a transition to another problematic that I become convinced of. There are many people in the theory of radical democracy, certainly Chantal Mouffe and Laclau and others, who will say that agonistic politics is the only answer, that we have to be struggling in rivalry with each other, et cetera. And the answer that, oh no, it's good to be peaceful is certainly not the right answer. But what is the right answer? It seems to me that if you follow what Bashir is arguing here, you will understand that it is not agonism that leads to truth, but it is a kind of openness to reason, which is the title of the book in English, not a bad title, I would say. And this openness to reason is precisely the necessity of having a conversation with others, right? And being able, not a dialogue of civilizations, nothing about us versus them, but just a kind of openness to an understanding that is not immediately comprehensible to you. And then, again, there's so much to say. There's a chapter on ecology, a lesson in ecology, which uses a kind of allegorical approach to interpret what must be a wonderful novel. It's kind of this guy who grows up in nature with no other human beings. It's kind of a Robinson Crusoe story. And what he learns is that he has to mimic nature. He has to be one with nature rather than dominate nature. But in that, there's a point that you make that I find really fascinating, which is allegory is necessary because words protect and preserve truth. That the nakedness of words, of brutal directness of discourse is not necessarily the way to get at truth. And again, that's something that I find in the reading, for instance, of the Old Testament or the Septuagint in the first century, which I find very convincing. I'm going to move now to another notion of stasis, which is staticness, which is the opposite of movement. What you call the horror of time, and that is, and of course, anyone who wants to lock in thought is going to have a horror of time, because time will erode that assurance that may be a transient experience. And this leads us, rather in a jerky way, I can see I'm making this a little bit more jerky than I had hoped, to a prediction, to our theme for next year, which is future, and to your understanding, which for me is so interesting, of future. And this is something that you can get from Bergson, you can get it from Rumi or Iqbal. You can get it from various sources. I'm going to add another source for you. This idea that, that truth is change, that change is precisely the what is meant by prediction, and that prediction is not meant to say, oh, this is definitely going to happen, so be afraid and fall back and be predetermined. No, not at all. But speaking in the future tense, speaking about a future, is precisely a call to action. It's precisely, well, I'm now going to quote, I think it's Iqbal, do not vilify time, for time is God. God is change. And I found that also in Octavia Butler, who's an African-American artist, who speaks about the future with allegories of science fiction. And here I'm citing from her, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. So there are these kinds of juxtapositions that are possible in the method that Bashir uses, which allows you, again, to open a discussion to a conversation that can be very, very broad. It doesn't have to be confined within one school of thought. And so I'm going to quote you here, saying that the creative word be is always an action, time after time after time. And that, I think, is interesting as well, and I probably don't have time to finish this one, but it has to do with another understanding of Greek words, and that is the distinction between chronic, or chronos, and the word that everybody thinks they understand, keros. And I think there's a lot more similarity between the first century Greek use of these terms and the kind of time that you're talking about with some of the people who are your interlocutors. Because it's not, as Agamben will say, for instance, that keros is this break, this rupture into the homogeneous empty time, which is the linear time of modernity. No, not at all. Chronos is not chronology, it's chronic. It's this repetitive time, it's the constant change, but it's a repetition. And what happens with keros is, and this I find so interesting because I never understood this part of Islam. Everybody says, oh, you kind of believe that fate is fate, you can't do anything, etc. Total misreading as I understand it. Because what happens if you think of, I mean, we say it all the time in daily life, follow your heart, follow your dreams, follow, your destiny, if you will. That doesn't mean that it's written as fate, but it does mean that there is something that drives you, that pulls you forward so that you can recognize these moments when chronos is interrupted, if you will, by keros. And keros then must be understood in the two meanings that it has and that, for instance, Benjamin recognized that it had. One is this moment of opening. It's not so much a rupture as a moment of opening. And the second of keros is the weather. Kalos, if anybody knows, pardon me. I'm trying to, keros ini kalos. This is, you'll hear it from Greeks, right? The weather is good. It has the same double meaning that temps has in French. Time, but also weather. So weather is this kind of moment of fortune that breaks into, that opens up a kind of chronic continuation of time. And if you're on the right course, if you know what you're after, you can grab that moment, which is not a woman that has to be dominated by force, as Machiavelli said, but rather a kind of opening where you know where you're going and you know how to act at that moment. And it seems to me that there's a lot that moves across that. Probably there is actual intertextual evidence, but that's not necessary. So in my final comments, I just want to encourage readers to, first off, buy this book. It's really, it's a delight to read, and you'll be really smarter after you put it down. And I want to encourage you to pay attention to the carefulness of the language. Let me give you two examples. We have time for two. One, when speaking about Ghazali's idea of microcosm, he writes as an explanation, that is to say, of the human and her various souls. So you just put in her. You don't talk about the whole problem of women in Islam or whatever. You just know that as a philosopher, it has to say her at that point, because the her is not eliminated from the idea. So you just put in her and you just leave it there. And I love that. Another example is it's the beginning of the book, in the year 632 of our common era. That's so beautiful, because common era is small letters, and it's ours. It's not CE, it certainly isn't AD, but it isn't the 10th year of the Hijra either, right? Our common era, it's so simple, but it's a gesture of inclusion that is very lovely. And then my last example of language, that having told us at the beginning of the book about the Prophet Muhammad's wondrous transport to the city of Jerusalem, his night journey, at the end of the book, you invite us, quote, let us now transport ourselves, right, to the beginning of the 1930s in Mali under French colonial domination. You see, so this word, this idea of transport moves us, and we understand it's somewhat miraculous to make that move, but we go with you, and we travel with you. So it's that kind of very subtle use of language that, to me, does a lot of the philosophical work. So the subtitle of this is Muslim Philosophers in Conversation with Western Tradition, but it's more than that. You are a philosopher African and Muslim, modern and Western, European and Islamic, because these categories don't divide the task of the philosopher. You are in conversation with the past and the present. You translate always among and between these dimensions. So the lack of capacity to know the transcendent means not only that we need to philosophize, but also that we need to philosophize together in conversation, always honing our skills at translation, always open to reason.
I've decided to focus on a very specific aspect of a rather ambitious book. I cannot assume most of you have read it, but it's a performance in translation at many levels. My point of departure is precisely the second example that Susan gave us, and that is the allegorical reference to Al-Isra.
The acoustics in here are terrible. So
Can you hear me
right
now?
into the mic.
To Al-Isra, which is marked with a very important proper noun, and that is Cherno Bokar Seliftal. I have one question, and that question is going to deal with dreams, but I want to contextualize that question in a very particular way, and do so in conversation with you about this wonderful book that you've written. And I beg your indulgence, bear with me, because some of this will be unfamiliar, but that's part of the task of this book, which is to not only translate the unfamiliar, but put it before you in its force, to call you to think with it. You begin the second chapter of the book by recounting the dream that the Abbasid Caliph Ma'mun had, in which Aristotle came to him and advised him to turn to the one God through reason, leading Ma'mun to establish the monumental Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, which, with the express project of translating all of the known knowledge in the known world into Arabic, and a translation project that's going to transform Arabic itself. In fact, there's a term that's important here, transmutation, al-masakh. I want to draw your attention to another dream by one of those important scholars you mentioned, and that's El-Hajj Umar Tal, the great uncle of Cherno Bokar Seliftal, and founder of the Tokolor Empire. Now, one of the interesting aspects about this book that struck me immediately is what you have done is you've taken a contemporary disputation between two anti-imperial movements, Qadariya and Tijaniya, and you've had them adumbrate the entire text, thereby situating the foundations of their dispute in the broader history of Islam. I'm hoping to make clear how he's done that in a way that's quite useful. And so the invocation of Tal at the end in relationship to this jumping, this transition, is no accident. Now, of course, the dream is found in Tal's famous book, Rima Hizb al-Rahim, al-Nuhur Hizb al-Rajim. An interesting title, right? The lances the lances of the party of the righteous at the throats of the despicable. And this is part of an important book that has to do with the dispute that Tal was having with the ruler of Futujalon, Al-Mami Omar Sori. Tal wanted to offer proof contra Al-Mami's claims that he was a heretic, that the Prophet loved him and loved him best of all. And he did so by recounting a dream. I saw in a dream Anas ibn Malik while I was in Messina. I said to him, "Are you Anas ibn Malik who narrated a hadith for the Prophet?" He responded, "Yes." God placed the interpretation of this dream in my heart. The dream meant that I had attained closeness to God and his messenger, and that I was among his inheritors, his servant, and the servant of his way. God made apparent to me both inwardly and outwardly that the prophet loves me by his bounty like he loves his children. For this I have more proof and evidence, which I would rather not disclose. As you know, the central figure of this dream, Anas ibn Malik, lived in the prophet's home since a young age, and so he knew his domestic life intimately. He also was the longest lived of those who had been the prophet's companion, and hence became one of the primary authoritative transmitters of hadith, at least for the Sunni. Although the Shia like him too, because he was in, Ahl Bayt, the house of the prophet. Like Ma'mun, Tal interprets his own dream, which he takes to mean he had become one of the inheritors of the prophet as well as a servant on his way, declaiming, "The prophet loves me by his bounty like he loves his children." Now, I draw your attention to this dream for two reasons, in the hopes that you will speak to some of the issues they raise. First, the epistemological significance of the dream in Islamic thought, which relates, as I will try to show, to the philosophical elaboration of wahm, imaginings. That is to say, the capacity of reason to connect the image to what it denotes. And this is at the crux of what you're trying to do here wonderfully, right? This is not only, as we know, a fundamental issue of semiotics, which is how I have always tended to render ilm al-kalam, not as theology, but literally, as you point out, it's the science of discourse. It is also at the crux of the activity of translation that Ma'mun initiated. Second, both Ma'mun and Tal's dreams turn on the operation of what you call in the book interpretation, rightly pointing out that this operation is fundamental to Islamic thinking, from Sufism to philosophy. In that regard, it is significant that Ma'mun's and Tal's interpretation of their own dreams is an act of auto-authorization that short-circuits regulating forms of authority for scholarship, such as al-isnad, the chain of transmission that takes you back to the Prophet Muhammad, and importantly, silsilat al-ijaza. The silsilat al-ijaza, you went and you traveled and you sat with certain scholars and you read with them. It wasn't that you read the book, it's who you read it with. And when they were satisfied you read it well enough, they gave you leave to go. And this, of course, is what will give us, initially in French, the whole notion of licence. It's the certificate of mastery, right? But it requires a chain of transmission. And as you know, when Tal dreams, he violates all of that, right? As does Ma'mun, and that's an important move. I am my own ijaza. Because the paratext of interpretation is always the Quran, so that even the project of philosophical translation and commentary is dedicated to bringing reason to illumination of revelation. I think it is important to distinguish between two quite distinct practices of interpretation. Bear with me, but you all are translators. Talkhis, which is synoptic abstraction, a brief résumé, with tafsir, which is an elucidating explication or exegesis, Devar Torah. Both are fundamentally philological enterprises, the interpretive objects of which are a class of linguistic utterances with historically determinate textual expression that is somewhat obscure. The critical difference being that the language range of tafsir is acutely constrained to one language, Arabic, in its most primitive. And this is meant in Vico's sense of poetic wisdom. I couldn't help note throughout the book that that question kept coming up. The revelation's there, but because it's humans and humans think, it must be interpreted. What is the order of interpretation, right? And the echo of Arabic that was always there. What is being interpreted? Whereas the range of talkhis is necessarily multilingual, principally moving across Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, but also involving Pahlavi and Sanskrit. It's not just that the books warranting interpretation are of different languages, but that the modalities of value, the ways in which the books are actually meaningful in the world, are dramatically at odds. The Arabic of the Quran is the universal language of creation. Its text, al-Mus'haf, is not created, but is a material manifestation of the agency of creation. And here I've identified you as a Tijani, so I know that you will agree with me on that very vexing question. Although that's not my zawiyah, that's not my tariqah, but we can agree. And so all possible meaning inheres in its form, which is inimitable. Its form is inimitable. Ajazat al-Quran. There is no question here of translation. Rather, there is the double imperative to first not translate, and then to study the historical formations of the language in and on its own terms as the key to resolving all obscurities and arriving at its true meaning. The Aristotelian organon that you attend to, in contrast, is a performance of translation that vividly foregrounds the incongruity and conventionality of human languages, and so too then, the dynamic historical malleability of meaning, its situatedness. Summarizing that dynamic is the fundamental charge of talkhis, which is why it is quite reasonable to render it as commentary. Because there is some aspect of descriptive substitution involved in the translation entailed in interpretation, there is also good reason for rendering talkhis as periphrasis, in the sense of synoptic abstractions. In its performance, talkhis is a summary of the historical transmission of human speculative thought, actualized in certain discrete bodies of knowledge. And that summary is contingent upon an ability to think a definite formation of thought across different languages without altogether losing its integrity or coherence. This, I think, is in play with your reading of Mahmud's interpretation of his dream of Aristotle, which is about the translations of Aristotle's work. Now, a work you don't mention, but I think is very much at play there, is the Poetics. And I'm going to take a risk because I think it's in the margins, fil hawamish of your text, and that goes to the question I'm going to ask you at the end of this. Now, there are a number of factors that explain the distinctive reception of Poetics in Arabic thought. To begin with is the matter of access to the original text that you reflect upon. Abu Bashir Matta bin Yunus made his well-known Arabic translation in AD 932 from a Syriac version that dated from around AD 900. The Syriac was based on a Greek manuscript dating from 700. Matta's translation was not well received by his contemporaries because it was thought too literal, and a later version by his student, Yahya Im'idi, was considered more reliable. However, we do not know whether the later version was gained from Syriac or Greek text, or what its relation was to the original. In addition to these translations, abridgments of the Poetics were produced by El-Kindi and Khawarizmi, which included brief remarks about the treatise without too much concern with sources. Abu Bashir Matta also transmitted the late Alexandrian curriculum of philosophical study, and here's the intertextuality that you're referring to, Susan, to which the rhetoric and poetics were added as the sixth treatise of the Organon, initially compiled by Aristotle's student, Theophrastus, those being the categories, of course, on interpretation, prior and posterior analytics, and the sophistical refutations. Al-Bashir Matta's most famous student, Al-Farabi, exercised considerable influence on subsequent commentators on the Poetics, however, with his Qanun al-Shi'r, canons of poetry. From Al-Farabi forward to Ibn Rushd, the question of desire and collective will in relation to imagination is presented as the concern of logic taken up in the Poetics. This begins with Al-Farabi's carrying the issue of psychological imagination elaborated in Psychis. The Latins call it de anima, and we call it on the soul, I think. I don't know why. Over into the aesthetics of the Poetics, where the imagination is not discussed at all. Coining the term takhyir, creative imagination, He laid the grounds for a new epistemology that aimed to supersede the distinction of psychology and aesthetics, and inaugurated that peculiarly Arabic discourse of philosophical poetics. The custom has been to call this lineage Aristotelian or Arabic Aristotelian, a custom that you violate. And I hope you appreciate that I'm following your lead in this descriptive poetic discourse that you follow. And it's important to challenge this custom, right? Because that is a custom of the philosophical history of philosophy, which gives the label simply because those in the line from El-Kindi to Ibn Rushd deploy paraphrases of Aristotle in their pursuit of knowledge. This is to presume that merely addressing the first philosopher, as he was called, necessarily makes one a disciple. The arduous task of critically deconstructing the historiographical basis behind this presumption need not concern us here. And again, I like how you sidescript the need to critique it by simply undoing it. What is pertinent to our concerns with the relationship between imagination and desire is the way the Arabic synoptic abstractions, mulakhasat, treated what gets called al-qiyas al-shi'ri, poetic syllogism, as a cognitive instrument long before Adorno asserted the priority of the object of art. The question is whether the Arabic mulakhasat are undertaken in the service of subsuming poetry to logic. The superficial answer is yes. But as Van Gelder and Hammond have made it possible for even the English language world to see in their compilation of medieval Arabic treaties, Takhyir, the imaginary and classical Arabic poetics, the Arabic engagement with Aristotle's poetics enabled myriad lines of thinking poetically, as well as philosophically about poetry. After Al-Farabi, it's Ibn Sina, Avicenna, as you point out, we call him in Latin. And his effort that stands out most of all. In this lineage, poetics has as its goal producing the activity of the imaginative faculty, which, as has already been remarked, is called takhyir. By Ibn Sina's account, the cognitive function of poetic images is the affective arousal, infa'al, of wonder or aggrandizement, downplaying or belittlement, grief or delight, without the purpose of what is said being to establish conviction or dogma. This is a precognitive mental activity in the sense that the conscious mind, as he says, or psyche, a nefs, is aroused to delight or dejection about a condition without conception or experiencing it perceptually. As a precognitive mental activity, takhyil arranges. It is the schemata of human behavior and activity in general, and is itself engendered by poetic expression. Here Ibn Sina is following Al-Farabi, who considered a takhyil al-sha'ri, poetic or affective imaging, as part of the formal analysis of what he called al-qawl al-sha'ri, poetic or affective syllogism, also known as al-qiyas al-sha'ri. Explaining the association between poetry and cognition, Ibn Sina asserts, poetic syllogisms cause acts of imagination, moving the conscious mind to pleasure and despair through the mimetic presentation, bil-muhaqa, of beautiful or ugly conditions. The imaginative representation generates assent through its use of mimesis, which involves generating, and this is explicitly taken to be in the sense of poesis, a faithful image of some original or thinking in images. This way of emphasizing the utility of imaginative activity in facilitating conception acknowledges one of the fundamental roles assigned to imagination in the Aristotelian psychological corpus, fantasia. What is distinctive in the Arabic language, lineage of thinking, however, is that the image is both a function of poetic statements, which are conventional, as in historical and material, as well as the imaging capacity of the mind, suggesting an isomorphic relationship between the activities of mimesis, poetic representation, expression, and the mental activity of image creation or imagination. As a syllogistic, poetic expression, in contrast to the epophantic syllogism, does not achieve demonstrative knowledge about the physical world as objective reality, but exhibits the workings, the capacities of the type of mind capable of achieving such knowledge. Lurking behind the approach to poetic statement as syllogistic is the persistent concept of the subject of knowledge. whose apprehension of the world is enabled by a willful intention that is heterogeneous from its object, that is, from the objective phenomenal world. So when you talk about the allegory of Ibn Sina, where it's about al-muhaka, mimicry, right? That challenges this notion of an integral subject in a fundamental way. And you see, I'm recalling for you to situate this within a long line of thinking and tradition. This remains, and unfortunately so in my judgment, the predominant understanding informing most authoritative handlings of such problematics as transculturation, hybridity, and the diverse social forms of globalization. There is also something at work in the concept of conscious mind deployed by Ibn Sina that is in tension with that dominant notion of man as the masterful subject of knowledge. This brings me to remark once again that Ibn Sina understands poetic imaging to achieve the arousal of takhyil as cognitive imagining, not in the sense of primal representations of sensory perceptions that stand in relation to external objects, but rather in the sense of the faculty that abstracts and manipulates those representations into particular images, the analysis of which underscores the conventional aspect of cognition. For instance, in his commentary of the Poetics, Ibn Sina states, when Aristotle refers to the first element of tragedy, he means the imaging invoking meaning, al-ma'ani al-mutakhayyala, and spectacular effect, to which is added melodic composition, al-luhn, and statement, al-qawl. For those are the means of representation, and the meaning of statement is the metrical arrangement of words or rhythm, al-mawazin. Now, those of us familiar with the received text of the Poetics may have already noted that Ibn Sina's periphrasis, imaging evoking meaning, al-ma'ani al-mutakhayyala, replaces opesis kosmos, which Halliwell gives us as the arrangement of spectacle, and annotates as the visual aspects of action, especially the appearance of the agents. Melody becomes a luhn, which replaces melopoeia, which again, Halliwell renders as lyric poetry, but Fife as song-making, with ayad following the latter in the modern Arabic text, giving it as al-ghana, singing, while statement replaces lexis, which by consensus is given in English as diction, and for al-ayad is al-ibara, meaning expression or utterance. These replacements are critical, because they are indicative of a singularly Arabic preoccupation with poetic expression as a form of cognition based upon a keen investment in the particularities of Arabic language poetry. So that the form of poetic expression stands in isomorphic relation to the consciousness, I'm almost done, of the listening subject, exciting a series of cognitive images that can arguably be taken as commemorative. Again, for the audience, you should know, and Tierno Diang knows this, that Tal is writing in Arabic, as is his great nephew, right? So Arabic is a universal language of intellection. That means something, not just in terms of ethnicity. When Ibn Sina then speaks of the imaginative force of poetic statement, he is referring to the cognitive function of poetry. And when he bundles the proposition with al-luhn, he is addressing the way in which the cognitive faculty of imagining can be and is motivated and directed by certain lived practices that are human constructions. This is even more expressly elaborated by Ibn Rushd, who in handling the poetics postulates that Arabic poetry excels in motivating the cognitive faculty of imaging, fostering a certain type of subject that enables a collective unconsciousness in affect. Because this is an active manipulation of representations, it indicates an agent, the subject who reproduces and composes images. Understanding what and how images are significant entails our gaining some understanding of the how-to of their order and arrangement, which means their source in the subject's agency. An express focus of Ibn Rushd's poetics periphrasis is the nature of the self engendered in cognition and its relation to the type of subject poetic expression fosters. In this sense, poetic expression's activation of the imagination can be construed as instrumentally intersubjective, generating what Ibn Sina designates as al-umma al-shi'riyya, meaning in this instance poetic commons, or even aesthetic commons. Indeed, we can also take it to mean affective commons. We come back then to the two dreams, both of which effectively engender commons. A committed community of activists in the service of political will. Ma'mun, the caliph, imposing rational order over an expansively heterogeneous imperium. Tal, the Tijani Sufi sheikh of an expanding empire in contestation with another. My question is, are their dreams, as legitimating expressions of knowledge, poetic? They certainly are not scientific.
Only if I get an answer.
Thank you.
You want to say a few words?
Well, my words will be mainly words of thank you for organizing this wonderful reception of my book in the first place, and for hosting me one more time in this place that I can call home. I call it home for at least two reasons. One is the many friends I have here, and the second is that my work is at home here next to yours. And I have seen that again and again, and I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for being here and participating in this reception of my book. And of course, I want to thank my two readers. I believe that reading share with translation something. Reading is translating into your own language, is giving hospitality to something in your own language. And that is really how I felt. I felt that you gave hospitality to my book. You are absolutely biased readers. I mean, no reviewer would, journal would ask you to review this because you're biased. But actually, in your way of being biased, you have learned me so much about my own book, about what it is that it says to you in your own language, and it was just wonderful for me to listen to that. So I will just react on a few points that you make. The point of dream, I'm so happy, of course, that you brought that in, and that you went from the dream of this Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who somehow, in a very Freudian way, needed authorization to translate Greek wisdom into the language of revelation. Because that was the problem. Islam faced that question the same way Judaism and Christianity had to face it as well. What to do with the love of wisdom, as philosophy is called, of these people who, after all, are just pagans. They did not have the revelation. So how can they have any wisdom that would be of interest to us, who have the Bible, the Torah, the Gospel, or the Quran? And this question was posed to Islam when the expansion of Islam led to the integration of all these places where philosophy was almost a religion. I mean, we forget it, but Neoplatonism was almost a form of religion. And somehow the Caliph needed to be reassured, and dream to play that role of reassuring us, restructuring our thinking. So seeing Aristotle in his dream, who told him that truth is what is true according to reason before it is true according to revelation. Because if something has to be revealed to me, I need to have first the faculty to understand that revelation. So it would be understandable that my reason comes logically first. So he was reassured and engaged in the work of translation. Now, R.A., you have made a connection that I love so much, because I have said elsewhere that, of course, dreaming or using the faculty of imagination, of representation, Aristotle's Fantasia, is an operation of translation. Because as you know, this faculty is the faculty that basically just makes images. That's what it does. Imagination makes images. Fantasia, same meaning, etymological meaning. So depending on the master it serves, imagination would be turned downwards toward the word of senses or upwards toward the word of the intelligible that would be reflected in it. And in these two cases, as you have shown, the dream of Sheikh Umar Tal and the dream of the Khalif al-Ma'mun had to be for them, they understood it as dreams coming to their imagination oriented towards upward, towards the intelligible. And since these kind of truth, the poetic dream, the poetic truth, to come back to your word, the poetic truth of dream comes with its own evidence, you do not ask further evidence. You know when you have dreamt it that it did come from that higher source. So you translate into images. That is what imagination does. And I like the connection you made. Because he translated in his imagination, he translated his dream of Aristotle as this authorization, he engaged in the process of translating now Greek philosophy. Wonderful connection. I will repeat it, and I will give you credit for that. And I will pretend that it was all along in my book anyway. So thank you for pretending that you found it so clearly in my own work.
Is that a complaint?
Yeah. And yes, and the work is all about translation. And translation, as you have mentioned, is really what everything that I try to do revolves around. From what I have done in logic, algebra of logic, to African philosophy, it has always been a question of translation. Algebra of logic, how come we translate everything we do into the language of our computers using 0 and 1? That is basically what I did when I work on Boolean algebra. And also how a language becomes philosophical through translation. How, by receiving Greek philosophy, Arabic became a philosophical language the way it happened to Latin. Cicero doubted that Latin could be philosophical. He was thinking, okay, if you want to do philosophy, you have to learn Greek, as, what's his name, the Nazi philosopher, Heidegger, would say, later on, philosophy speaks Greek. Yeah. And here it is, speaking also Latin, learning to speak Arabic, and today, re-speaking Hausa, Fulani, Wolof, because you are right. Chernobokar Salif Tal writes in Arabic and explains Arabic, but most of his teaching is also in Fulani.
Halpular.
In Halpular. And in doing that, he is making his own Fulani language, the Halpular language, a language of philosophy, which is a task that we are facing. We, when I say we, philosophers from Africa, who are now working also with making our languages, our indigenous languages, once again, language of creation and science. And that is an aspect that was of interest to me. And this is why I wanted my last chapter to be about this Malian, to do the transport, to do the mirage, to travel to Mali and get there. Since you have mentioned something about the title of my book and also the language of my book, there are two people that I want to thank. One is my publisher, Wendy. You know, we know here, people, scholars who write books, that the title, the cover really belongs to your publisher. They they insist on having their own way with the title. And most of the time, actually, this is something I discovered, they are right. She picked up a phrase of mine about openness to reason in my book, and she thought that this was the right title of it in English. And I really think that she was absolutely right, and I'm glad you made that remark. The other is my translator, because the book was originally in French, except parts that I wrote directly in English. The introduction I rewrote, and the conclusion that the new conclusion that I gave. And it is the way in which it happened. Jonathan Adjeman, who translated this, is not a professional translator. He was a postdoc teaching a class, and he needed some chapter from my book, and he translated it into English for his class. And then he sought me out and sent me the translation and said, as a courtesy, I'm sending you this translation. I loved your book, etc. And I fell in love with what he said. And he said, by the way, if you're interested, I would be interested in translating it all. And I say, you know, Jonathan, I'm very happy. I hope to meet you. I'm happy that you are offering this. And it also happens that I could definitely find some funding too, because I don't want you to work for nothing here for that. And this is how it happened. So a real coup de foudre he had for my book. And because it's true that in French, this is probably the most written book of mine in the French language. For some reason, when I wrote it, it was a time when I was in love with French. It doesn't happen all the time. But I enjoyed it. I had some kind of jubilation with the language, and he captured that in his writing. It's different. You felt that. And so I have to thank him for having worked with me. We worked on the translation together, and the way in which he has captured what I wanted to do, not only with the ideas and also with the language. And you are right also, Gary, saying that although I talk about figures of Islamic philosophy and topics of Islamic philosophy, it is also one of the most personal books that I have written in terms of finding myself in this as well. Translation. There is this expression, translatio studii, or the plural, translatio studiorum, which is a way of saying the translation/transmission of Greek sciences and philosophy to Europe. At least that is what Translatio studiorum started being understood when late in the history of Europe, actually, philosophy was constructed as the unique telos of Europe, deciding that philosophy was born in Greece, spoke Greek out of a miracle, and then was transmitted to Europe. So traveling from Athens to Rome, and from Rome to Heidelberg or London or Paris. And it is just not true. If you look at things, and actually the medieval philosophers themselves who coined the phrase translatio studii knew that this was not the case. If you take Roger Bacon, who wrote in the 13th century, the Doctor Mirabilis, as he was known, said that God gave wisdom to human beings in Hebrew, then in Greek, then it was in Arabic. And he said, well, we have translated a few things in Latin, but Latin was really not the language of creation of philosophy. Mind you, we are so used to Latin being the language of philosophy, we cannot imagine Roger Bacon thinking that Arabic was much more suitable for philosophy than Latin. So he would not have thought of translatio studii as being this unilinear path that went from Athens to Rome and Rome to London. But it was constructed like that mainly by the likes of Hegel, your good friend Hegel, very late. Even a philosopher of absolute beginning or tabula rasa like Descartes acknowledged that the very matrix of his philosophy came from a foreign origin, because the matrix of his philosophy, as we know, is algebra, and he would say, well, algebra, it comes from something foreign in the sense of outside Europe. So it took really philosophy during the premises of colonialism to decide that it was the unique feature of Europe, of what Husserl will call the European humanity. So translatio studii, the transmission of Greek philosophy into Arabic is very central to our task of decolonizing the history of philosophy. And that is one of the goals I was pursuing also with this book, showing that you do have this trajectory. The translatio studii made tours and detours. You can say Athens to Baghdad, Baghdad to Cordoba, Cordoba to Fez, Fez to Timbuktu, by the way. Important to put Timbuktu on the map because it also destroys one received idea that African cultures are married with orality. That if you say African cultures, you have to say oral cultures. This is not just true. Historically, starting as early as 9th or 10th century, you started having a tradition of written erudition in large regions of Africa, of which all the manuscripts that you find now in cities like Timbuktu are also witnesses. Another reason why I wanted the last chapter to be also a chapter happening in Mali and following that transportation. So now, yes, pluralism obviously is something crucial here. About Ghazali, I had a wonderful story. Once I was invited, it was in London at the Center of Muslim Civilizations, which is a beautiful center, college and kind of institute of advanced studies as well, created by the Aga Khan and Ismaili. And I was invited to give a lecture, and without thinking, I decided to give a lecture on Al-Ghazali. And it is when I sat and that I thought, my goodness, this could be seen as being provocation. Ghazali is a kind of, he considered himself a kind of champion of Sunnism and Ash'ari theology against precisely all the other interpretation of Islam, including Shiism and Ismailism in particular. But as I started explaining that Ghazali is, in fact, a thinker of pluralism, that his works where he is so on the attack against philosophers, against everybody, against philosophers, against the Fatimids, against the Shia, etc., is one aspect of his work. But if you take his latest works and his understanding of the full notion of pluralism, it becomes something different. And that is something I have tried to do in this book, having 2 chapters on the first Ghazali, the second Ghazali, and I'm glad that, Susan, you paid this very precise attention to that. One last point about time. Time is, of course, very important here because you mentioned the horror of time. Fundamentalism is precisely about the horror of time. Fundamentalists hate time because they think that perfection is always in the past. Once perfection has happened, the only thing that time can do is erode perfection, of course. If by any chance Plato's Republic came to exist in this world, if that was possible, for something as perfect as the Republic to exist in our world of generation and corruption, it would be destroyed very quickly, because that is what time does. Time is destruction for fundamentalist thinking, when you think that perfection of being in the first place. Now, the philosophers I'm interested in, and you mentioned them, Bergson, Iqbal, Teilhard de Chardin, or Senghor, are precisely philosophers for whom, far from being the enemy of being and perfection, time is the unfolding of being. And in fact, the concept of change comes first before the concept of being. There is a traditional privilege of what is stable over what is becoming in the history of philosophy, because that is the path into which Aristotle engaged the history of philosophy when he turned his back to becoming and decided to give a very spatial notion of time. When he defined time as the number of movement according to the before and after, in fact, he was translating time into space. He transformed time into distance. And that was a way of taming time, but we needed to rethink time, and this is something that Bergson did. And the philosopher that is at the center of my work here, because the philosopher who taught me how to think in Islamic philosophy, Muhammad Iqbal, is the one precisely who, in conversation with Bergson, reopened what he considered to be the dynamic understanding of time that for him is the true cosmology of the Quran, where change comes first, when God himself is time. That statement that you quoted do not vilify time because time is God. La tasurru dahr, inna Allaha huwa dahr, is a hadith, a prophetic saying. Yes, that Iqbal repeats again and again, which is to say two things. Change comes first. And you have no privilege of rest or what is stable. And first thing. And second thing, time is not the enemy, and time is the unfolding. We learn about history. We do not have just this kind of continuous erosion going from the golden generation to what we are right now. On the contrary, time has brought all the of history and what we can learn about history and so on and so forth, and this was very important. Another aspect of the opposition that you beautifully stated between Chronos and Kairos. Chronos, or serial time, the time of chronology, or the time what Bergson has called serial time to oppose it to duration. Kairos comes precisely, as you have said, as this disruption or this eruption. It is, to use the language of Bergson, the way of bringing the vital into the mechanical. Chronos is the time of mechanical, what is mechanical. And Kairos is precisely this vital moment. And the way in which it is translated into Iqbal's philosophy is to say that Kairos is the time of prayer. Prayer is defined by him as this interruption of the mechanical succession of moments into and this eruption of another time, something that is not serial time, that we might call the time of eternity. The moment when we can have a vital connection with us and with the word and the totality, instead of having this kind of mechanical connection to things. So yes, again, thank you for these two concepts that clarify very much many things of that what I've been saying. So in this case also, I will use this opposition, Chronos and Kairos, in the near future.
Let me add just a couple of quick comments, questions to this last bit among, I mean, there's so much in here that's so rich that I'd love to ask about and talk about, but on this last piece, I'm fascinated in this book and your work generally, the way in which that focus on becoming through all these different traditions and these different thinkers lead you and them so often to that constellation of seemingly non-philosophical things poetry, dreams, imagination, image, prayer, love, which is, central in here. So that's already extremely interesting. And I wonder about translation there, intra-philosophical, not just translation between languages or between traditions, but there's a way in which that we see in here, in your staging of the relationship between religion and philosophy, for example, or Greek and Islam, that the kind of the movement out of philosophy brings us into a more deeply philosophical place, and the movement very deeply into philosophy seemingly brings us again and again to these non-philosophical, non-discursive, non-rational domains.
One thing that Iqbal shares with Nietzsche is to believe that in its highest form, philosophy becomes poetry. That's something that Nietzsche says. This is also something that Iqbal says, and it goes against what you have said. You have ended on the whole poetics of everything, the imagination and the language of dreams not being science, but not being either the contrary of science. It's not that they are opposed to science, it is just, and believe it or not, I connect this to Boolean algebra. Boole famously said that at one point, mathematics could be almost as true as poetry.
Almost.
Could you expect that from a mathematician, saying that at the finest point that it could reach, mathematics could be almost as true as poetry? Yeah.
This is like Cantor has the same sentiment and expression.
Yeah.
So does Dedekind. That all the great mathematicians understand the work of imagination as being essential, especially those who were involved in the analysis in the post-Luke.
And
Just on the image, when I was going through this and thinking, I don't like dialectics so much, because what dialectics is doing is saying, I am the subject and I will include the antithesis in myself, in my own thinking. And for Adorno, in one sentence, I'll get it all there. But here I would like to say Benjamin's notion of a dialectical image is not the same. And allows this opening. And what I also like very much is that this poetry is not the antithesis of reason, nor is it the dialectical other of reason.
Exactly.
But they have a very different relationship which demands a translation between them. I wanted to put in a word for Benjamin because I think his notion of dialectical image, I don't know what you think, but might fit.
Can I say something? I'm anxious to hear from the floor, but to engage some of your last remarks, which are really
quite insightful and much appreciated. Of course, the distinction that we're talking about, I'm always careful about this word, philosophia, right? Which is something, as Plato taught us, dogs do. But the distinction we're working with is an old one. He actually did say that, by the way. Philosophers are dogs. Between techne poetike and episteme, which is Aristotle's. That's part of what I'm pushing at. And what's interesting about the Islamic tradition is they follow the heretical Alexandrian school, and they don't accept the proposition that logic interprets poetry, that Plato reads Homer, right? But in fact, say no, poetry itself, in its image generating, is the way in which the majority of people come to truth, right? Through the image, and that has its imperial aspects to it as well. We need to be careful about it. And Tal played with this in very express ways. He's speaking in Polar, but he's dreaming in Arabic, and he's speaking in Polar about dreaming in Arabic. And in that ambiguity, what he presents are images, right? In fact, we could call them almost tone poems, because when he's speaking, there's a rhythm. When he's writing, there's a rhythm, and it's very much there. So it skirts the distinction between philosophy and poetry and overturns the Western tradition, which I would say is not so much the problem of philosophy, but ontology.
I want to open it up too, but I'm going to add one more thing in the spirit of dreaming in Polar, about Greek, etc. I mean, through this whole conversation, and to link it to translation into our general conversation that we'll take up tomorrow, throughout, you've paid, and all of you have paid this really close attention to the embeddedness of philosophy in these languages and the very careful ways in which different languages, philosophy can't be separated. And you decolonize this European story of transmission from Greeks through Latin to now, but you don't ever land in a relativist place. You never land in a place like we only have language or culture or perspective or experience. You actually land in a place in this book and all of your work for philosophy, and you have this question here where you say, and it's meant and it's rhetorical and it's provocative and playful all at the same time, where you say, how can we speak of an Islamic philosophy or a Chinese or an Indian or any qualifier, use any qualifier without contradicting the very idea of philosophy? And it's that tension that also maybe in some ways speaks to the problem of translation. Again, not just between Greek concepts and Arabic concepts, but between the way in which philosophy is necessarily embedded in ways of life and ways of, and specific languages and traditions, and always, back to Susan, transcends them. So I don't know, does translation figure in that balancing act that you're always trying to do?
Absolutely. I believe very much in translation, in the sense that translation is this operation that a priori should not work, but in the end always works, provided that you consider the untranslatable part of it. In other words, the misunderstandings or the untranslatables are all part of the same operation. Being in one's own context, one's own language, etc., is not something that and we would have contexts that do not communicate, is not something that I accept in the first place. That is not my position. And the authors that I have been studying here precisely teach me that this should not be the... you mentioned the discussion, or you mentioned it, the discussion between Abu Bishr Mata and As-Sirafi. How modern is that language? They are discussing the difference between philosophical grammars, to use a phrase by Nietzsche. If you say that every single language has its own philosophical grammar, something that Nietzsche says, and says that it is to be expected that Indo-European languages, for example, where you have the verb to be being used the way it is used, to be, einai in Greek, esse in Latin, all these Indo-European languages share the way in which you can use be, add ing, and have being. Einai becomes on. Same thing in French, être et étant, etc. What happens if you have another language where you do not have the same use of the copula? Yep. Now, the temptation would be a radically relativist temptation to say each language carries its own philosophy. Well, if that is the case, everybody is going to stay home, and then we don't need to come together and try to talk to each other, because we would have radically different, incommunicable experiences. But precisely, we are not trapped by our own philosophical grammars. There is something called translation that happens between philosophical grammars. Without ignoring their plurality, it transcends that plurality. And that is the difficulty with the notion of pluralism. Notion of pluralism is this kind of fragile notion which is not abstract universalism, which is imperial. It is not relativism. It is in between. And that in between has all the problems that all in betweens present, but it is what we have, and this is where we try to construct and build something like a human society.
Beautiful.
Beyond our tribes.
Let's collect 2 or 3 questions at a time. Sadia, Gavin.
So I'm going to ask a question.
Let's take a couple.
Yeah.
Take a couple at once.
I don't think it's movable.
Thank you.
Right. So I'm going to ask a question about Iqbal, and
I'm glad that he had such a great effect on you. I'm not the biggest fan, so I mean, the work. I loved everything else you said, but I'm going to push a little here, right? Two aspects of Iqbal, and I love the poetry, so I'll take that too. Although Punjabi poets have been very explicit about the way in which his adoption of Urdu, speaking of translation, has actually also been contributed largely to the erasure of a certain kind of Punjabi poetics, and which has had terrible consequences for the Pakistani state, right? And for Iqbal, as the person whose notion of becoming is also going to help the Pakistani state become. And, right, so I mean, there's something to keep in mind there, right? So what exactly is the relationship of that becoming? And now I understand that Navida Khan has written this rather fantastically, I think, in the sense of very imaginative, bordering on fictional. And I love Navida otherwise, but a sort of notion of becoming and Iqbal, and which makes the Pakistani state a much less terrifying thing than it is, right? But Iqbal has a lot to do with that, right? So perhaps one more thing we want to add in here is also not just Chronos, but Topos, and the way in which a certain notion of becoming kind of gets instantiated in space, and how that instantiation has very dangerous effects, right? So, and Iqbal is, in that sense, the philosopher of the Pakistani state, right? I mean, although he would probably be terrified by what happened in his name. But added to that, then, of course, is, I mean, I would say that you say that the fundamentalists have a horror of time, but there's a moment in Iqbal's thinking, I would say, and I'd like to hear, I mean, it's not just a comment, I'd like to hear how you respond to this, right? It's both about the Pakistani state and then about the Ahmadis, right? The Ahmadi or the Ahmadiyya, right? Mm-hmm. There's a moment in Iqbal's own thinking, and this is in all of his writings on the Ahmadis, right? Where there seems to be a fear of time and of change. And that fear of time has to do with the fear of future prophets. So his relationship with what's known as the Khatm al-Nabuwat, or the end of the line of prophets, is precisely the danger of the proliferation of future prophets, that Islam may not be the end of time, right? Or that at least the revelation may not end in time. There might be other revelations. So the Ahmadis are particularly terrifying. Of course, they're turned into imposters precisely because they challenge the one break that is allowed in Muslim time by Iqbal, right? So maybe I'm kind of, I mean, I understand that this might even be considered a tendentious misreading of Iqbal, if one wanted to be more generous to his notion of becoming. On the other hand, these are the instantiations of his thought that have a very real purchase today. Let's take translation again into topos, but also into law, right? I mean, these are legal and constitutional facts in the Pakistani state today. So I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation and all the, I think, very important points that were raised about the book. I had a chance to read it before I came, and I wanted to ask you about something that you touched upon towards the end of your response, which I think was kind of, in some ways, a summary of part of the conclusion. This idea that translation, thinking translation and decolonization in the same sentence, and what happens there when that takes place. So this idea that you say one of the lessons to be drawn from teaching philosophy in Muslim countries and everywhere concerns the study of philosophy everywhere. And then you go on to say that what it is that the history of philosophy needs to be decolonized, and that as a result we need to understand what translation means differently. And I guess I wanted to say, as a comment, what's really interesting about, it happens really fast in the book, but I think there's a lot to unpack there, is like, on the one hand, translation, there are so many books out there that discuss translation almost exclusively as a colonizing practice. And so already it's challenging that kind of narrow understanding of translation by putting decolonization right next to it. It also challenges what's basically colonialism in disguise, which is this sort of liberal multiculturalist form of, which is why figures like Zizek don't like the word translation and typically contrast it with discussions of, say, the everywhere or the universal or so forth, because of a fear that when you mention that word, you're immediately subsumed into this idea of inclusivity and tolerance. That there might be some sort of other type of, the translation, in other words, moves towards something rather militant, something like the history of decolonization. But then on the other side, equally, it challenges, translation challenges decolonization and different sort of stereotypes of what decolonization is really all about, that it's about separatism or strictly independence, particularism, retreat, turning away, and not opening up the world, establishing absolutely new types of relationships. And so I was struck by I feel like all of that's in the course of a paragraph in the book, which I think is really exciting. But I raised it because I wanted to say that I feel like there's a third term, which is universality, that we've talked about through email before, but this mention of the everywhere feels like, I just wanted to invite you to think about that third term in relation to the other two that you raised, translation and decolonization. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful.
There was a hand in the back.
Why don't we take these two and then we'll go to the next round, Yusuf. So hold on. Let Bashir.
Well, thank you first for these comments. So Sadia, on Iqbal.
I apologize for
No, it's a very important point, because Iqbal had the peculiarity of being claimed by the whole spectrum, in political spectrum, so to say, in Pakistan, from the left to the right. And why is that? How come?
I have a leftist in my novel quote.
Yeah. Not surprising. Because, so the whole point is that there is the play written by Ellen Sixus, in which Iqbal appears as the Amdane, the bad, evil person who whispers in the ears of Muhammad Ali Jinnah and led Muhammad Ali Jinnah to actually separatism, and somehow was responsible for the separation between Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. All coming from the fact that, as you know, when he became the president of the Muslim League in 1930, as such, he did say that there was a need for the majority Muslim regions in India to have autonomy. That's the only word he used. He never used the word independence, to have autonomy, because he thought that the time and the responsibility of the biggest Muslim community in the world, except Indonesia, their responsibility was to precisely lead this notion of a reopening of Islam as an open society. How do you do that if you are if you do not have autonomy as Muslim within the Indian parliament? That was the conundrum he had to sort of face. My sense is that his idea was to have some kind of Muslim caucus within the Indian parliament. We will never know, because he died, as you know, in 1938, 9 years before independence. But that is one aspect of his thinking. And when you say he transformed, he turned the whole idea of becoming into what Pakistan has become afterwards, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about what he would have liked Pakistan to be, or if he would have liked Pakistan at all. Yeah. I'll come to the Ahmadi. Yeah. I'll come to the Ahmadi. It, for the time being, about the separation. Nehru wrote in his Discovery of India, he tells the story of his last visit to Iqbal on his deathbed, basically. And he said that the conversation he had, they were very, he said that they had a kind of bond coming from the fact that they were both Kashmiri Brahman originally, so to say. But that is the anecdotal aspect of it. And he said that at one point he said to Iqbal, don't follow Jinnah. He is a politician and you are a poet. That was very interesting. His thinking was that actually it was Jinnah who was pushing towards separation and not Iqbal. Now, setting apart the political question of the separation between Pakistan and Ahmadiyya, Iqbal's philosophy is that Islam went through some form of petrification around the 13th century. And that his work, the philosophical task, was to, as he gave this title, reconstruct the religious thought of Islam out of the 13th century petrification in which Islam is until now, until his time and probably until our time as well. So he thought that opening was coming and that you could see the premises of that opening during his time. And he said that there were signs of that even in Saudi Arabia, because he considered the modernist side of Wahhabism. The fact that Wahhabism at first was saying that actually jurisprudence should not be binding the Muslim society. Legal acts that were taken in the past should not impede progress. That side of Wahhabism interested him. He was also interested in what was happening in Turkey. The Mustafa Kemal Atatürk revolution and the abolition of the caliphate, he thought it was a good thing because the future was for Islamic communities to become what he called, quote him, a living family of republics, now that the whole caliphate was out. And he considered also Babism, this movement in Persia. And he considered Ahmadiyya, because the renewal of Ahmadiyya for him was also part of that renewal. So, and this is something we were saying, you have two discourses of Iqbal about the Ahmadiyya. The one in which he saw in Ahmadiyya the reopening of the gates of ijtihad, the reopening of Islam and the reconnection of Islam with its own principle of movement, very much like what Bergson would call the open society. And the text he wrote against the Ahmadiyya was against the claim of prophecy. In other words, he was not sure if Ahmad was a prophet or a reconstruction of the religious thought of Islam. His thinking hesitated between embracing Ahmadiyya as this reconnection with the principle of movement he was calling for, or recoiling against the notion that in order for renewal to happen, you need to have a prophet, because he had written about precisely the significance of the end of prophecy. For him, the end of prophecy was not to say God had sent a few prophets and he decided that the last of them would be Muhammad. He said that Islam, as the last of the three Abrahamic religions, is the discovery of the necessity to abolish prophecy itself. In other words, now that the principle of movement were there, human beings were left only with that principle of movement. And this is why he particularly saluted the one statement made by the one who was to become the second Caliph of Islam, Umar, when he said that the book of God is sufficient for us. At a time when the Prophet, who was dying, was saying, oh, give me a pen and something, I'm going to write something that would prevent you from erring. And people were saying, does he have his mind? Does he know now how to write? Because he was supposed not to know how to write. And Umar said, I know that he is anxious about us, but we will be fine. The book of God is sufficient for us. And Iqbal wrote that this had a deep philosophical meaning, that we do not need prophets anymore. So you can see the kind of challenge that he was facing with the movement of Ahmadiyya. Either he considered it as a new religion in the sense that Ahmad was a new prophet, and then it went against what he had to say about the open society and the dynamic religion not needing a prophet anymore. Or he considered it as a sign of a reopening, on the contrary, of the otherwise enclosed and petrified Islam, and in that case, he would embrace it and praise it. And you have the two Iqbal. And this is why, and this is something we were saying, you have part of the Ahmadi movement, actually, that claims Iqbal, but the majority of Ahmadi movement would consider that. Yeah, because of what he wrote. Precisely, it went in the direction of what he had to say about the reopening of Islam. So that is the complexity of his relationship with Ahmadiyya that you do know. Colonization and translation, I have written in somewhere else that yes, indeed, one can consider translation as a decolonization. Of course, if you look at the politics and the sociology of translation, here you have naked the domination of certain languages. If you look at the sociology of what is being translated from which language into which language, you do not need to have many figures to figure out that English is the imperial language that we have all to speak, and so on and so forth. But what I want to claim also is that if you reduce the whole question of translation, so if you look at the big picture, you think translation is domination. And this is the title of the late Pascal Casanova, whom we miss so much, La langue mondiale, traduction et domination. The word language, translation and domination, meaning that translation is connected with domination. But the very act of translation, and earlier I said, and this was not, and I meant it, that I considered that reading me the way they did something that translators do, which is giving hospitality in one's language to a content that was thought in another language. So the act of translation is an act of hospitality. If you just consider the task of the translator, the way in which the translator, in the very action of translating, comes in contact, as Benjamin says, with that pure language, the pure language that exists only virtually. Nobody has seen anything like the pure language, but it does exist at that moment when hospitality is given in one language to something that was thought and created in another language. So you kind of abstract, you kind of bracket out the word of domination to isolate this ethical moment where translation means hospitality. And that is what I am aiming at. And because of that view that I have on translation, I do believe that even in the most asymmetrical situation, translation does create some form of reciprocity. even in the colonial situation, where a language presents itself as the language, the logos incarnate, and everything else is just some kind of bubble that doesn't really deserve the name of language. Even in a situation like that, translation can be a gesture of decolonization. If I take authors in Africa, authors that my good friend Parfait sitting there works on, like Bernard Adjei, Birago Diop, Amadou Hampâté-Bâ, all these people who transcribed/translated into French the traditional oral literature. You can read it in two different ways. One, you can say, oh, they are surrendering to the imperial language, because that is what it could be seen as, meaning you admit that your culture can only exist if it is translated into the language. Or you can see the gesture of doing that as a creation of reciprocity with the language that presents itself as the imperial language. And that is somehow what they did with the way in which they appropriated the French language. So these are two ways of reading the same reality. And I admit with you that they are totally irreconcilable. But there is a logic in thinking that the gesture of translation, the way in which these people who were considered just tools of transmission to the colonial administration of the information they needed for goals, purpose of governmentality, I need you as an interpreter to let me know what the situation on the ground is. And I need you as interpreter to transmit my orders to the ground. They expanded their role. They did not limit themselves to being these interpreters, these tools, and they became translators of their culture. In other words, they looked at the bigger, larger picture, and they thought, okay, this French language, we are going to appropriate it as well, and we are going to translate who we are into that language. Now, this position of mine is not the kind of agonistic position. Of course, I'm not someone who would be just, always screaming at everything being colonial or neo-colonial or post-colonial. And my good friend Ngugi wa Thiong'o was just appalled when reading everything good that Senghor had to say about the French language. And I was just telling him, Ngugi, what do you expect? He's a poet. You cannot not expect from a poet to declare their love for the language in which they write. You can't just write the most beautiful poetry in French of the 20th century and at the same time pretend that you are hating this language. It's not true. You love it. So, and that is how I see also this kind of ethical decolonial meaning of translation. So translation, yes, I can understand fully that translation is maybe a manifestation of imperialism, but I believe in the ethic of translation. I am a Bermanian in that sense. I follow Antoine Berman, his idea that translation is putting in touch languages, and that putting in touch languages, the ultimate meaning of reciprocity is something that I see here. Now, Zizek is this. Well, I follow my good friend Hamid Dabashi in his reading of Zizek, although I would not, as he does, use those F words that he used writing about Zizek. But this idea he has that, let's after all leave all this multicultural thing, the pluralistic thing, the translation thing, let's come back to the universality of class and so on and so forth, because these post-colonial people are just, I don't want to use those words, so, and I don't want to say it in French either. But that is his position. What he doesn't see, this is not new at all. He pretends that this is new, that he is going beyond the politically correct of considering minorities, yes, etc., and but it is time that the left reconstructs itself around the universal categories of class, etc. This is not new. This is all the story. The French Communist Party has never been an anti-colonial party. The fact that that left was profoundly, deeply Eurocentric and universalist, just as the right, was nothing new. You have to come like him from other parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, to think that you are doing something new. You are just reinventing le fil à couper le beurre, as we say in French. The fact that that left that he represents has always been this universalist, Eurocentric, blind to. And that is the left against which Aimé Césaire wrote, saying, I am not against universalism, but I just want to find myself in what you present as universal. I want to recognize myself in that. And I am not sure that the colonial paternalism is worse than the communist fraternalism that you are proposing. And that is what Zizek is doing. So, yeah. F you, Zizek, as Hamid Dabashi famously wrote.
I want to make sure Youssef gets a chance to raise a question. Are there any other last questions?
Okay. I'm not sure if we have time to this very big questions I'm asking, like thinking of the title of the book, Open to Reason. Are you believing one reason, like Aristotelic Greek reason, like, so thinking of dreams as a source of knowledge in Aristotelic reason?
Right.
Or there are many reasons. This is the first issue. Second issue is thinking of Islam and the tradition of Islam, and I'm recalling Talal Asad. If we believe that there is a tradition of Islam, that means that there are other traditions that not really traditions of Islam. So is there a tradition of Islam, one tradition of Islam? Which Islam we are speaking about? Which tradition of Islam? Mm-hmm. The third issue, thinking of Arabic. Definitely there is no one Arabic now, at least. So thinking of translation, which Arabic we are thinking of? Is it the Latin Arabic, like the Fusha, which is Latin for the everyday life? People don't recognize this Latin Arabic. Or which Arabic? So
yeah.
One more question. Pass the mic down.
Hi. I have a question about the title, but a little different from the one that was just asked. In French, the title was Comment philosopher en Islam, and the cover of the book has someone who's clearly a philosopher / scribe, intellectual, person of the world, writing something. And the title here is Open to Reason. It has the word Western in it, and it has the Kaaba on the cover. And it's an image that strikes fear into the heart of many people in the West, not just in this country, but across the world. And to me, it goes back to the issue of, you made a statement right at the start where you said that translation allowed Arabic to become a language of philosophy. And I'm wondering what happens to that in just the mere translation of this title, which to me proposes something quite different, a different idea of what philosophy is, a very different idea of what Islam itself is, and proposes, forgive me, a kind of appeasement to particular political compulsions that perhaps are not in the book itself. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because we're talking about decolonization and we're talking about politics. And it seemed like the original title suggested something quite different of this book. So in a sense, the very translation of the title is also permitting us or giving us license to translate something very different into this book now in English, which I found a little troubling. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I'll try. Thank you so much.
And forgive me for my suggestion that there's some sort of appeasement, but it's a proposal I'd like to make.
Absolutely not. You are absolutely right, and I would claim the word appeasement for this reason. First, you are right. The title was, in French, Comment philosopher en Islam, sounds different from How to Philosophize in Islam as a translation. I was not sure about the title and the translation, so my first suggestions was to say themes and topics in Islamic philosophy, something very descriptive, because that was not problematic at all, because it just described from outside something that the book does as well. Now, open to reason, why it interests me, and I'm connecting that with the question, is it Youssef? You said Youssef, yeah, that Youssef posed. It is not that reason, in this case, is opposed to any other of our faculty, and we mentioned imagination and the poetics of imagination. Let me take an example to show what it means that it is not opposed to that. The book of Ghazali that I study in one of the chapters, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the deliverance from error. In that book, which is strikingly analogous to what you find in Descartes' meditations, the approach is the same. You doubt everything until you reach the indubitable. What you cannot doubt is going to be, of course, true and self-evident. You need reason for that. You need reason to reach its peak in order for it to reach the point of its own perplexity. And the whole approach of the book is to say, if reason reaches what looks like a dead end and reaches the point of perplexity, then reason is ready for another faculty which is in us and us all to open up, and that faculty is what philosophers have called either prophetic faculty, if they speak the language of illumination, or if they speak the language of Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism, they would call it the active intellect. So you would find active intellect in Al-Farabi, and in this case, in the case of Al-Ghazali, he speaks about the light that was cast into his heart by God. So in other words, rationalism is not opposed to what we could call here mysticism, or the work of imagination, or the work of the prophetic faculty. On the contrary, the awakening of that prophetic faculty presupposes that rationality has reached its own end and its own purpose. In the same way that we supersede our senses by our rational faculty, that prophetic faculty supersedes our rationality. So it is not opposed. It is at the very peak of rationalism that somehow this other faculty can open up. Now, that's one aspect of your question about reason. So I come back to your question here about why in the title this Western and conversation, Western tradition as well. And you say if there is not an aspect of appeasement. Let me describe something that I call appeasement here. I mentioned Iqbal. Iqbal constructed his philosophy both from the deepest of Islamic tradition, to talk about that tradition, the tradition of the fully achieved human being, the Insan Kamil, and also he considered that the notion of time as openness and the open society and this open religion is something that comes for him from the depth of a tradition represented by Jalaluddin Rumi that he quotes, etc. At the same time, he is in conversation with this quintessentially European philosopher who is Henri Bergson, whom he met. And he found that they were thinking along the same lines in terms of their conception of time, in terms of their understanding of the role of the mystics in a society. Both of them thought, and this is something you find in the reconstruction of religious thought of Islam by Iqbal, and you find in Bergson's two sources of morality and religion, the idea that the word society, human society, produces these exceptional beings, human beings, men and women, who are capable to tap the élan vital, as Bergson calls it, this push of life to revitalize society and open up religion. So that is the vision they share and the vision on which they exchanged. And Iqbal and Bergson somehow wrote their own works out of that conversation with each other. Influence doesn't just go the way from Bergson to Iqbal, as many people might think, because Iqbal's reconstruction were a series of lectures he gave in 28 and 29 in India and published in 1930. Bergson's two sources of religion and morality was published in 1932. So if influence there is, it would go from the reconstruction to the two sources. In fact, it is not influence at all. It is what I call precisely conversation. This is why I'm using this word of conversation. Now, yes, Bergson has never written the word colonial. Colonialism was not in his thinking at all. Nevertheless, we can see how his thinking had an importance in the colonial world and was used as a tool of emancipation out of colonialism. The speech he gave in 1914, right at the beginning of the war, about why he thought that Germany was the aggressor. He said, basically, the way in which Germany had realized its unity was through mechanical means. The force of Prussia brought together all these regions speaking German. And he said this was violence, because it was not done through what he called the ordinary work of life, but through the violence of mechanism. And it was for him inevitable that that same violence Germany would project and expand to the rest of Europe. He was immediately translated into Arabic in Egypt. Why? Because the intellectuals who were around the journal Al-Muqtafa in which it was translated were interested in the fact that precisely what Bergson was saying about the violence, the mechanical violence of Prussia, was exactly the mechanical violence of colonialism. So here is a discourse that was intended for totally different purpose, finding its way into the colonial world and becoming paradoxically an anti-colonial philosophy and purpose. Hence the beginning of the interest of that word for the thinking of Bergson, of which Iqbal also is a heir. So you can see what I call a conversation, and a productive one, between these two philosophers. And yes, I do believe that you do not need, in order to be decolonial or post-colonial, to just consider that you have to only quote your own people, be in conversation with your own people, and be enclosed in your own liberation and emancipatory discourse comes from everywhere. You build it, you construct it, and that construction, yes, if you want to call it appeasement, I would embrace the word. And that is how I understand the meaning of conversation between the two. And I am very much interested, and that is the significance of the book that is coming out. I was interested in the way in which this Jewish philosopher who was attracted by Catholicism but stopped short from converting because when World War II happened, he decided to wear the yellow star and remain, as he said, with those who are going to suffer. I like the very way in which he had this conversation with the Muslim Muhammad Iqbal and the Catholic Leopold Sedar Senghor on the other side. And that is the kind of philosophical conversation that I do believe in. I do believe that philosophy is dialogue. Plato is right. Philosophy has always happened through dialogue, and that is how the company of philosophers is always growing.
Beautiful. So, two things. Hold on. One, we are going to have three things. Reception downstairs, 5109. We will continue the conversation, including we can, argue and dispute. Two, this conversation is going to continue all day tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m., 10:15 tomorrow morning. Please come back. It will only unfold. And three, thank you, Bashir, Susan, and R.A.
Thank you. Thank you.